once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you. This song was a #1 hit in the 60s in Great Britain. It was in the top 10 in the 70s in Italy. But it wasn't until the 80s that it was heard by American audiences. And this song, now very famous, it took 53 years from the time it was written, actually, for it to become recognized for what it is. The Songwriters Hall of Fame called it one of the top songs of all time. And the song, Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World. And in case you've forgotten it, let me help you remember. Here it goes. I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Oh yeah. What do you think? Does it remind you of Louis Armstrong at all? What a great song. It talks about kind of what's behind me. What a wonderful world God created. And yet it's not a perfect world, is it? It's a beautiful world, but not a perfect world. This week, I pulled up a headline that said this: unspeakable horrors, dozens of babies' heads chopped off. And of course, it's referring to Hamas and their attack on Israel. And then we're reminded that it's not always such a wonderful world as Louis Armstrong would have us believe. Now I want to transition from a wonderful world that's not always wonderful. Even the beautiful scenery behind me, sometimes it's all covered in gray and you don't see those mountains. And sometimes we can't translate a wonderful world into a beautiful life. And that's what we're going to talk about today, a beautiful life. And so it's one thing to look at scenery like we have behind us here in the fall of Colorado. However, to see a beautiful life is not always that simple. And so we start with this discussion question: what is a beautiful life? Can you describe a beautiful life? We have been taught by our culture to look to celebrities for a beautiful life. And right now, I don't know if you've noticed, the media is all over Taylor Swift and her romance with this Kansas City Chief tight end. And I look at that, Christy and I talk, and we go, I don't get it. I don't know what the big deal is. So celebrities supposedly live a beautiful life, and then we find out, not so much. They're really not that happy and content in their lives. And then there's the well-off, the well-to-do, right? We always look at their lifestyles, the homes, the many homes they live in, the many cars they drive, the many places they travel, the beautiful clothes they wear, and say, that's a beautiful life. And yet that's not always the case, and it's not something really we should emulate, is it? On November 15th of 2006, a young man by the name of Abraham Shakespeare, isn't that a great name? Talk about parents who wanted something great for their kid. Abraham Shakespeare happened upon a convenience store with his friend. And his friend went in to grab something to eat, and he said, hey, buy me a couple lotto tickets. And Abraham had always wanted to become rich instantly. And lo and behold, on that day, at that convenience store in Florida, because Abraham Shakespeare was just a common worker, I think he was a landscaper of some kind. He had always wanted to be rich and rich quickly. And behold, on that day, those tickets, when they were scratched, amounted to $30 million, and his dreams had come true. Now, out of that $30 million, about 18 million of it actually came to him. You know, the government wants their part in it. But $18 million, you should be able to live on that for a while, right? Well, it didn't take long before that $18 million became $2 million. You see, he had to buy the mansion, and he had to buy all his cousins' mansions, and he had to pay off a friend's barber shop that the man owed 87 grand on, and things like that happened, and he got down to the place where he only had $2 million, only after a couple of years. In fact, one of Abraham's cousins put it this way, so eloquently. He said, he was their cash cow. All those people he knew, he was their cash cow, and they milked him daily. So you get a picture of what happened to all that money. And then one day, a lady by the name of D.D. Moore showed up at his house, and she said, I'm a journalist. I want to write a book about you. Your story is amazing. And as they got to know one another, she found out that he had lost most of his fortune. And she said, you know what, I'd like to help you. If you'll allow me to be your accountant, I'll give you some advice on what to do with the remaining money so it'll last. And so he welcomed her into his life, and lo and behold, she really made a difference in his life. I mean, she had him do things like stay home, don't go out, because people are going to take your money. But then one day, his friends and cousins and parents stopped hearing from him. And so they contacted her, and she said, well, I had him go away, get away from all this. Well, days went into weeks, which went into months, which went into a couple of years. Finally, in 2010, I believe it was January 25th of 2010, he was found, at least the remains of Abraham Shakespeare was found, buried in the backyard where a slab of concrete had been laid over him, and behold, her brand new RV was on top of the slab of the concrete over the top of his remains. You see, becoming wealthy isn't always what it's cracked up to be, is it? It's not always a beautiful life. I'll bet at some point Abraham was rethinking whether he should have ever won those lottery tickets, especially when she came at him with whatever it was, a gun or a knife or whatever, pills, to make sure that she could take the rest of his money from him. So who in all the world might be able to give us proper instructions about living a beautiful life? You know who it is. It's what the Upper Room is about. It's about making sure you know Jesus. Because in this study we're doing in the Upper Room, in the book of John, we're finding that Jesus shows us exactly who God is, right? And so, of course, Jesus says these famous words that really gives us the instructions about how to live a beautiful life, or rather, how not to live a disastrous life. He says in Mark chapter 8, verse 36, and what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? And then he poses this question, which is an absolute showstopper. I don't know if you've pondered this question lately, but you should. If you want to know Jesus, this goes to the heart of his kingdom and understanding wisdom of following him. And he asks this question, is anything worth more than your soul? Have you pondered that? Because we tend to invest a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of energy on a whole lot of other things that have nothing to do with our eternal soul. If only Abraham Shakespeare had understood those words and applied them to his life. But it's not just the celebrities. It's not just those who want to be well off. It is also the powerful that present to us this idea that they have a beautiful life. Do they really? Christy recently began a book by Christy recently started a book by Bill O'Reilly called Killing Kennedy. As you can imagine, he's going to go into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and somewhere in the beginning she read this line to me and it cracked me up, okay? And I think Bill O'Reilly, he's an intelligent man, but he said this probably with a straight face, or wrote it with a straight face when he wrote it, and he put it this way: in spite of his numerous extramarital affairs or indiscretions, John F. Kennedy loved his family. And when she read that to me, I started laughing. It's like, really? Who now is defining love, right? So the powerful, I mean, they even are not content with the life they have. Would you call John F. Kennedy's life a beautiful life? I don't know. It didn't end very beautifully. You might remember the name King Nebuchadnezzar. It's one of my favorite names in the Bible. He's not one of my favorite people, but Nebuchadnezzar, what a great name. And he reigned over Babylon around 600 BC. He actually reigned as long as any king in that kingdom. He reigned for like 55 years, something like that. You might remember that in 597, he conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it and took captives back to Babylon. Amongst those captives, of course, was Daniel the prophet. And so with that backdrop, and you've got to know that King Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful, powerful man. And he was even a nice guy at times. I mean, besides conquering other countries and cities, he built the Hanging Gardens for his wife who missed her homeland. What a nice guy. But he was kind of full of himself, and he started having dreams, and none of his wise guys could interpret those dreams. So he heard that this Daniel guy from Israel could do it, and his dream was about the fact that this tree reached up to the skies, up to the heavens, and it was mighty and powerful. But then this angel comes in and cuts it down. And then the angel says that for 7 years this stump will just remain ugly. So when Daniel was summoned, he said this to the king. You find it in Daniel 4:27. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be then your prosperity will continue. But he didn't listen to Daniel, and then we find in chapter 4 verse 33, he was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. He went insane for 7 years, as the dream predicted. When he came out of his insanity, here's what he said. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. He knew that by personal experience, didn't he? Okay, second discussion question. Do you believe that King Nebuchadnezzar lived a beautiful life? Well, of course, the jury is still out on whether Nebuchadnezzar lived a beautiful life. It probably comes down to what part of his life you looked at, right? At the very end, maybe, as he started to praise God and give God honor and glory when he'd been humbled. Up until then, he had done some beautiful things, but he also done some ugly things. And that's why this is not an easy question. What, in fact, does a beautiful life look like? Our assumption is that the saints of the past all lived beautiful lives, right? I've mentioned the Babylon Bee before. I love their satirical headlines. Here's the one I saw this week. Saints in heaven shocked to learn Catholics have been trying to talk to them this whole time. The saints in heaven are just kind of ordinary people, you know, who decided to fully live for Christ. But the idea that they'd be worshipped is shocking to them, because they realize if they've lived a beautiful life, it had nothing really to do with them. Every indication in Scripture is that the disciples of Jesus were living ordinary lives. right? We've talked about that. You know, fishermen, tax collectors, you know, you got it. They're just ordinary people. And yet, we come to find out that their lives turn into something beautiful after having met Jesus. And so in this series, again, we've talked about Jesus showing us who God is, revealing God to us, so we get a really accurate picture of who God is. It's the book of John. We pick it up in John 1:35. So it's been a few lessons. If you go back to John 1:35, let's get to it. The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" You might remember we talked about how powerful that question is. What do you want out of following Jesus? That's a great question. We talked about that. Let's move on. They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you'll see." That's an invitation, is what that is. So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Verse 40, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ." And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You're Simon, son of John. You'll be called Cephas," which translated is Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Okay, so we have now at least 3 people with whom Jesus has had conversations and invited them to follow him. I want you to turn to the book of Mark now, chapter 1, and we'll go to verse 16. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. I want to stop right there. We'll talk more about this, but they did follow him, but they still were fishing. They still were doing what they need to do to bring an income into their family. Verse 17, Jesus called out to them, "Come follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." In other words, I have a whole new life for you. Verse 18, and they left their nets at once and followed him. That's interesting. We're going to talk about that. Verse 19, a little farther up the shore, Jesus saw Zebedee's sons, James and John, in a boat repairing their nets. Not very good fishermen. They're always repairing their nets. He called them at once, and they also followed him, leaving their father, Zebedee, in the boat with the hired men. They're leaving the business, and they're leaving their father. So they're leaving family and business to follow Jesus. Now we jump to Mark chapter 2, verse 13. Then Jesus went out to the lakeshore again and taught the crowds that were coming to him. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," he says. So Levi got up and followed him. Now the big question that most people ask is, what would cause these men to instantly stand up, walk away from everything they know to be with Jesus? Interestingly, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was asked that question. Is there a psychological reason that was going on here? A sociological reason? So Bonhoeffer has a great answer to that, I think. I want to read it to you. He said this, "Unfortunately, the text is ruthlessly silent on this point as to why would somebody do that. It displays not the slightest interest in the psychological reasons for man's religious decisions. And why? For the simple reason that the cause behind the immediate following of the call by responses is Jesus Christ himself. It is Jesus who calls, and because it is Jesus, they followed at once." Do you get that? There's no psychological reason, sociological reason. Jesus is enough. When you truly meet Jesus and come to know him, he is enough to abandon all else, is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer is saying. So here's my premise in this lesson. I'm going to say it right now, get it out there, and now we'll think more about it. And the premise is this. I believe that those who live the most beautiful lives are those who have decided to fully devote themselves to following Jesus. That's a beautiful life. Notice, just like the mountains behind me, has nothing to do with fame or power or wealth. There's something about Jesus himself that following him is really the most beautiful life you can ever live. But I want to bring this up because of the text we just read, and because I'm not sure that even those of us in our spiritual family always know that. So you'll be tempted to say, well, of course the most beautiful life is following Jesus. The problem is we run headlong. It's actually a collision with our culture that says that power and privilege and autonomy and control is what really matters in this life. And so to become a follower, for your identity to become about being a follower, not a leader, a follower, to abandon all notions of power and prestige and control and autonomy, that is something that we deeply disagree with. There's no way you can, by following someone, become important in this culture. And so until we put aside those cultural notions, following Jesus, at least the way most of us see it, is nothing more than lip service. Well, of course I follow Jesus. But unless it becomes more than lip service, I want to offer to you that we will not live beautiful lives unless we truly follow Jesus and find all our identity, all our worth in being with him. And we'll talk about practically what that means. I want to take you back to 1925. And in 1925, Clarence Darrow was a very famous man. You don't remember him, but if I tell you what made him famous, you might remember kind of who he was. He was an attorney, and he was in a trial called the Scopes Monkey Trial. That's what it's famously been called now. I believe it was in like Tennessee, where they decided that a teacher who had taught the theory of evolution in a classroom, a public classroom, should be charged with some kind of a crime. And so they brought him before a jury, and the man defending him was this very Clarence Darrow at the time. And the funny part is, later, when they interviewed this teacher, he said, I actually don't even know if I've ever taught evolution, but I am the person they chose to bring this case because a shift was taking place in our culture, right? Now here, almost 100 years later, we can't even fathom it being illegal to teach evolution. In fact, it's just the opposite, right? If you teach creation in a public school, now you might be brought up on charges, okay? So that's what's changed in 100 years. But it was this trial, the Scopes Monkey Trial, because the teacher's name was Scopes, that made Darrow famous. And he was famous after this trial, as they finally discovered that, yes, this man cannot be charged. This is okay from this point on to teach the theory of evolution to young schools full of mush. And so the shift had taken place and everything turned from that point on. But again, Darrow became famous here. He lived in Chicago, actually, and became a very famous, popular, and wealthy man. Now, I want to fast forward to the end of his life. He's in his 80s, and he's talking to a friend sometime before he dies, shortly before he dies. And here's what Darrow said. I have lived a life without purpose, without meaning, without direction. I don't know where I came from, and I don't know what I'm doing here. And worst of all, I don't know what's going to happen to me when I punch out of here. When I punch out, I'm going to die. And I have no idea what's going to happen to me. Well, he was famously an agnostic. He had made fun of the idea that there is a God to serve. And so, does it really surprise you that at the end of Darrow's life, he doesn't see the point? There's no purpose, and I don't know where I'm going from this point on. It's really a statement of despair, isn't it? And I take you back one more time to the same passage, again, Matthew 16:26. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Here's the question again. Is there anything more important than your soul? And again, you might say, well, of course, there's nothing more important. Then why is it that you and I spend our lives pursuing things that have nothing to do with our soul? So if we're going to say that my premise is true, that being a follower of Jesus is really the beautiful life that we are created to live, then we've got to ask the obvious question. What then, at least then in those days, what was a follower? What was that all about? Well, it was very common, actually, for people to follow a rabbi, okay? And it would be them kind of signing up to do that. In Jesus' case, he picked them after a night of prayer on the mountain. But in this case, people would follow a rabbi, and the idea was twofold. Actually, the idea of follow me was one concept. The commitment to follow was a whole different concept. And Greek scholars tell us that the language there is really important. It packs a punch with two ideas behind it. Number one is the response to a call to be a disciple assumed a desire for a deeper relationship with that rabbi. And also, the second part that we'll get to is it also assumed that there would be radical reformation in your life once you started following that rabbi. And following that rabbi, by the way, had to do with abandoning everything else and doing everyday life all the time with that rabbi. Now, the problem for you and for me is we don't really have that concept in our culture. There's the apprentice concept, and that is I will go and work with somebody and they will teach me how they do what they do, right? But the idea that I will walk away from everything and be with this person all the time, really, I can't find it in our modern times, which makes being a disciple of Jesus hard to understand, as you can imagine. Now, what's interesting that most of us don't realize is that Jesus' ministry, his ministry, had actually, from the time of his baptism, had actually been going on for at least a year before he assigns these 12 apostles. Does that make sense? He assigns 12 apostles. We call them the disciples, but there were a lot of disciples. But it wasn't until after a year or so that Jesus says, you and you and you and you and you. I invite you now to come do life with me. I will be your rabbi, your teacher. And they all knew what that meant. That's why you see them abandoning their businesses, abandoning their families. And again, it was something that these guys thought they'd never be invited into. They didn't even dream of ever being a disciple of a rabbi, because the rabbi was the only way to really know God. And so the opportunity was more than they could pass up. And that's important because I don't think we've really understood that these guys had kind of been around Jesus for a year. They had kind of watched him. See, it wasn't just that he walked up to them one day and they'd never seen him before and said, you, follow me. And they go, okay, oh, my life sucks. I can't stand my family or my business. No, they had seen him. They had watched him. They had marveled at him for a year. And then when he says, come, do life with me, they knew what that meant. Joseph Stoll, in his great book, Following Christ, puts it this way: relating to this rabbi is an adventure in wisdom that is freshly alive and rewardingly different. Isn't that great? An adventure in wisdom. They knew how to make money. They knew how to take care of their families, but they didn't have wisdom for all of life. And this was refreshing to them. Years ago, C. Blendinger put it this way: the pupil who chooses to subordinate himself to a rabbi follows him everywhere he goes, learning from him. So, taking someone as your rabbi was a choice to do life with them in order to learn from them all that they knew. The ancient Talmud actually has a great story about a disciple who decided to sneak into the home of his rabbi and hide under his bed so that he could be there when he and his wife came to bed. And so he's in there with the slippers underneath the bed, and somehow he's discovered by the rabbi, and the rabbi wants to know, what are you doing? And here's his classic response: this too, Rabbi, is Torah, and I need to learn. Maybe he took it a little too far, but you see the mindset of people? See, we don't have that mindset. Jesus, I am going to do every minute of life with you, and I will look to you all the time to know what life is about and who God the Father is. And see, that's something that's a lot different than, yeah, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, That's different than being a follower of Jesus. And that's what these men were. There were other followers. There were women that followed. But specifically these 12 he assigned. Do every minute with me. Biblical scholar Ray Vander Laan has looked into the history of the Jewish people, and he has found a saying there amongst the people that understood the relationship with the rabbis, and it goes like this: may you always be covered by the dust of your rabbi. In other words, may you follow him so closely that the dust his feet kicks up is what cakes your clothing and lines your face. Okay, that speaks of intimate, constant relationship. That's different than being a Christian. Christian is a system I believe in. A follower of Jesus is in constant, intimate relationship with Jesus himself. The second part of being a disciple, as I mentioned, is the radical reformation of the life, and that's what these guys understood. Who I am will change now that I have a rabbi. So followers became imitators of the one they were following. So it begs the question for you and for me, how much like Jesus does my life look? Really? All right? I'm not talking about going to church. My everyday life, my attitudes, perspectives, views, values, do they reflect the fact that I follow Jesus every minute of every day? Then my life will change. Now, one of the refreshing things that we see in the upper room, and I've heard it several times in the last couple of weeks amongst people in our house church, down in Tucson, we had this discussion, and that is how radically your lives have changed. In fact, I have heard from family members of some of you all who say, you don't get it. He is a totally different guy. This is not the same guy I grew up with or that I used to know. Do you know how great that news is? That means you are following Jesus, because you can't be the same person you used to be. And if I am, if I'm no different than I was before, I've got to ask the question, am I just a Christian, a believer, or am I following the Messiah closely, intimately, constantly? So to get the contrast, let me put it this way. Believing is a spectator sport. Following makes you a player. Are you a player? I know that has other connotations, but are you a player? Because that's what following makes you. You get in on the ground floor of the field, the court, where the game is being played. The game of following Jesus is about being there with him, doing life with him. So as you know, I grew up mostly in the 70s, and in the 70s, what I heard about as I grew up is that it was all about going to church, or maybe being a Christian. Maybe that's what it's all about. As we've said, now the term Christian means nothing. And so I take you to, again, Dallas Willard, for those of you in Tucson, Dillard, as he says this in The Spirit of the Disciplines. Most conservatives by the early 1970s generally accepted that being a Christian had nothing to do with actually following or being like Jesus. It was readily admitted that most Christians did not really follow him and were not really like him. In fact, in some circles, the only absolute requirement for being a Christian was that one believe the proper things about Jesus. Has that been your life? I believe the things about Jesus I should believe, right? He's the Son of God, which makes me no different than the demons. They know he's the Son of God. See, the difference is, but should I maybe take the next step and make my life about being like him, not with the sandals and the robe and however long the hair was, but like how he saw life, how he treated people, what he valued, what was truth to him, because he is truth. Gandhi was once asked by a close friend, if you love Christ so much, why don't you become a Christian? And he reportedly said, when I meet a Christian who is a follower of Christ, I may consider it. William Tyndale in 1536 proposed to putting the Bible in English. It had never been in English before, and since everybody in England spoke English, why don't we give the Bible to every single person, to which the church was not too happy about. And so they had him choked to death for daring to do that. He did it, and his last words were, Lord, may you open the eyes of the king. Well, eventually the eyes of the king were opened, and the Bible was fully translated and given to people. And again, you go, well, that's what someone who wants to follow Jesus must have. But see, up until that time, it wasn't thought that you should actually be like Jesus. You just need to do what we tell you to do. And that's really modern Christianity for an awful lot of people. And so that's what a follower of Jesus, or a rabbi back in those days, what it entailed. So last discussion question, if that's what it entailed back then, what does following Jesus look like today? Okay, another way of putting that question might be, how do I transition from a dutiful, distant, one-way relationship with Jesus to a life-transforming pattern of being with Jesus? I think I've mentioned to you before that some 24 years ago, something like that, 23 years ago, I had an adventure that I've never forgotten. A guy named Carl Parker, who worked with the railroad there out of Tucson, said, hey, would you and a buddy, which was a guy on staff, would you guys like to go rattlesnake hunting with me? You see, what he would do in the desert when the train stopped to do whatever, they would get out and they would hunt for rattlesnakes. So he'd become kind of a professional at it. And so my buddy Tim and I thought, could there be anything more exciting than hunting rattlesnakes? And so we went. I'll show you a picture of Rattlesnake Rock, just northwest of Tucson, about 30 miles, where our buddy Carl took us at night in the summertime. And we began to climb that rock. If you can see it, it's not just a rock, it's a bunch of boulders that you climb up on. And as we walked up there, my memory, if it serves me right, is that Carl had the only flashlight. And so, as I remember that night, following Carl and his flashlight, step for step, became very important to me. In fact, I became passionate about walking in the steps of Carl up to the top of that little mountain. And lo and behold, I don't know if we have any pictures, I'll see if I can find some. We did capture quite a few rattlesnakes, but I can tell you, not for a second did I think of diverting from the path that Carl was on. Why do I tell you that? Maybe you've already got it. The point is, to follow Jesus is to make sure you never divert. You don't even think about stepping out of the path that is being led by Jesus with his light, because that's the only way to life. And I can tell you, I would have ended up in the hospital if we made it to the hospital if I'd gone off on my own. And it's such a great example of what following Jesus means. It means there's nothing more important to me right now, or as long as we're on this rock, as long as we're on this big rock called Earth, than following the light and the footsteps of the one who knows what life is about. He knows where the rattlesnakes are. He knows when to divert. He knows where the dangers are. He knows where we will find what we're looking for. That's what it means to follow Jesus. Again, back to Bonhoeffer in The Cost of Discipleship, he writes, discipleship means adherence to Christ. Christianity without the living Christ is inevitably Christianity without discipleship. And Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ. And here we are. I mean, he wrote that, wow, maybe almost 100 years ago, certainly 80 years ago. And here we are today with a Christianity without Christ. That's really what we have. A Christianity without Christ. Why? Because there are so few who follow hard after Jesus, and that's the predominant thought of their life, the passion of their life. That is to be a disciple of Jesus. A lot of churchgoers, a lot of church members, a lot of Christians, a lot of believers. Not many. Not many. As Jesus would say, there will be few who follow me. So let me summarize this. While following Jesus may not look exactly like it did for the early disciples, where they abandoned their families and abandoned their careers to be with him, it certainly does look like we will view our families, our careers, hobbies, everything else radically different than we did before we followed Jesus. Is that describing you? You look at life radically different? Your life looks radically different? As I said, many of you in the upper room, we have experienced this with. Glory to God, that's so exciting. Hebrews 12, verse 1 in the Message puts it this way: we'd better get on with it. Strip down, start running, and never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. I love that phrase, parasitic sins. That's what sin is. It's like a parasite inside us that just eats away at who we are. Keep your eyes on Jesus, like I kept my eyes on Carl. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race we're in. Study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed, that exhilarating finish in and with God. He could put up with anything along the way, cross, shame, whatever. The command from there that we're to obey: keep your eyes on Jesus. Command number 2 out of there: study how he did it. Is that your life? You're so focused on Jesus, all of this stuff is riffraff, and you study how he did life. We go on to Matthew 11:28, again in the Message. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Let's look at those commands from Jesus out of Matthew 11. Here they are. Come to me, get away with me, walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it, learn from me. It's a good place to start, right? Walk with him, work with him, learn from him, do life with him. That's what following Jesus is. That's the beautiful life. It has nothing to do with fame or fortune or power or prestige. It's just living as Jesus would have you live if he had your life to live right now on this earth. And then, of course, Jesus hammers it home in Luke chapter 6, verse 40. Students are not greater than their teacher, but the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. Our goal then? To be like the teacher. How? To be fully trained. Are you in that training? Or are you pursuing the stuff everybody else is pursuing? And you're wondering, why is my life a mess? If you're wondering why your life is a mess, it's not that complicated. It sounds complicated. It's actually simple. It's just difficult. It needs to be a life of being trained by Jesus. Back to Joseph Stoll in Following Christ. If Christianity is dull and boring, if it is a burden and not a blessing, then most likely we are involved in a project, not a person. A system, not a savior. Rules, rather than a relationship. If you find this boring and dull, it's pretty simple. You've got your eyes on the wrong thing. Rules, systems, religion, not Jesus himself. You may have heard of Polycarp. If you've not heard of Polycarp, don't know what his last name was, or his first name. I don't know if this was his middle name. I don't know. But anyway, Polycarp lived from 69 to 155 AD. So that means Polycarp came along just some 35, 40 years after Jesus. So this is how fresh this all was for him. He knew people who knew Jesus, most likely. He was a pastor, they call him the bishop, of the church in Smyrna. You might remember the book of Revelation, one of the letters is written to Smyrna, the church in Smyrna. Okay, so again, all these connections are really special, and he was absolutely adamant that Jesus was all that mattered, and the Roman government would not have it, because Polycarp, as popular as he had become amongst a lot of people, he would not bow down to Caesar. And so they came to get him, and they begged him. They really liked him. They begged him, just acknowledge that Caesar is Lord. Just acknowledge that. And that these atheists, that's what they called the followers of Jesus. They called them atheists. They don't believe in our God, so they're atheists. They said, just swear down the atheists and just simply reproach Christ. That's all you have to do, and your life will be saved. And here's what Polycarp famously said. 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How could I blaspheme my King and my Savior? I love that phrase, he has done me no wrong. Has Jesus done you wrong? Is that why you're focused on what everybody else is focused on? I dare say, if you know Jesus, he's never done you wrong. He's never done us wrong. Why would I serve anybody but him? Why would I pursue all the gods of this world as everybody else inside the church as well are pursuing? when in fact he is the King and he is the Savior. I want to close with a story I just heard the day before yesterday. So there's these leaders in one of the house churches here in Montrose, a couple, and they have lived next to a couple outside of Montrose who they've known for some, I think, 12 to 15 years. But this couple they live next to, although they're good friends with them, are atheists. But they have continued to do life with them and serve them as Christ would have them do. And they recently were getting ready to move, and so this couple in our house church said, we're here for you. And they worked their tails off to help them. This is an older couple by now. He was a fairly successful businessman in Montrose. And at some point, after they had gotten everything done for them and had them over to dinner, this couple began to talk about beliefs. And the guy in this couple I'm talking about just was flat out honest with them, you know, and said John 14:6 says Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life. He did not mince words. And at the end of that conversation, the lady said, well, I can't agree with you. Okay, so end of story, right? No, the next day, the man came over and he said, you know, I know you won't take any money from me. You won't take any of the stuff we have. They had a lot of stuff. He says, but you've told me about your church that you're a part of, the Upper Room. And so he says, so the least I can do is give you this. And he gave a sizable check to the Upper Room. And the guy of our Upper Room was astonished when he did this. And then the next day, the guy came back and handed him another check, a larger check, and said, I didn't do enough. Here's more for your Upper Room ministry, for your church. Now, I tell you that story. Number one, God has provided in this ministry like crazy. But I got to tell you, this is a first, to have an atheist contribute to a ministry to which he has really no interest in other than his connection, and that is living next to someone who follows Jesus. That's what this story's about. He recognized that this couple follows Jesus, and he'd never seen that before. When you truly follow Jesus, it's astonishing to people. So much so that an atheist would say, here, keep doing what you're doing. It's an amazing story. John 10:10, Jesus says the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. That's how most people live their lives, following his path. I, however, have come to give you life and full life. Life in the full, abundant life. Dare I say, a beautiful life. These mountains are beautiful. They're not always. Sometimes they're covered up. But I tell you that a life which is devoted to living by following Jesus is a beautiful life. It is the only assurance of living a beautiful life. And I pray that you continue in that life. And if you've not actually entered into that life, you've just been a churchgoer, a believer, a Christian, that you will begin to passionately follow Jesus and live the beautiful life. It may end with a hanging. Who knows? But it's a beautiful thing. Just as it was for Polycarp, who was burned at the stake, but the flames did not consume him. That's how the story goes. So they had to put a sword through him, and he was good with that, because that minute his life became even more beautiful. Thanks for joining us. Great to be with you.